Max Verstappen is back on the top step of the podium. We knew coming into this race it wasn't going to be McLaren's best track, but I don't think any of us expected to see them beat by almost 20 seconds. How exactly did Red Bull and Max pull this one off? It wasn't the most exciting race, but thanks to some late race calls by the McLaren pit wall, we have a lot to talk about. And we're going to get into everything we saw coming out of Monza, all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. That'll do it for the European summer, and did we end it with a surprise? With Max Verstappen taking home the victory in dominant fashion in Monza, beating Lando Norris, who finished in P2 by 19 seconds. It was Max's third win of the season. But where did this pace come from for a car that struggled so much this season? We talked about it a little bit in the preview episode, but it was a handful of things. The first being, this track layout is just a lot more favorable to the Red Bull car compared to others that we've seen this season. And on the flip side, it's not so favorable for the McLarens, especially in straight line speed and just how much they struggle in that area. And we saw a lot of that on Sunday. The other thing, though, we talked about this in the preview episode too, but originally, Red Bull didn't look like it was going to bring a special rear wing for Monza, which you see from a lot of teams just because of how unique this track is. Except they did, and they did it on the fly, literally cutting down Max's rear wing going into FP3. And that made a huge difference. And we started to see that on Saturday in qualifying. And what a incredible qualifying lap by Max to get pole position. He now has as many poles as Oscar Piastri and one more pole position than Lando on the season, which tells you a lot about Max's abilities, especially his abilities to just put together the perfect qualifying lap. Because this is not a Red Bull car that should be on pace with the McLarens in qualifying, especially with where these McLarens have been, but we see it more often than not with Max, where he just pulls a miracle out of his hat and just surprises us all, even though we shouldn't be surprised at this point. But that really set Max up for this win on Sunday. But honestly, even without pole position, if Max is starting P2, P3, P4, maybe even P5 or P6, I still think he's winning this race because this Red Bull car was quick this weekend. And really, other than a few moments at the beginning of the race with Max and Lando fighting and Max giving the position back to Lando because of that just move going into the first chicane where Max went off track, which I think it was a little touch and go. I don't know if Max was going to get a penalty for that move, but still the right call by Red Bull. And I think Red Bull knew at the end of the day, we might have McLaren's number this weekend, and we might have just a much stronger pace in our car than they do. So let's play it safe. Give the position back, Max. We'll get Lando later. And they did. I think it was on lap 3 or 4 that Max ultimately got around Lando and really started to pull away. And at that moment, you're watching this thinking, this is Max's race to lose. This car is way too fast, and the McLarens just couldn't keep up with him. And we saw that with the timing sheets, especially in that first stint. And really, it was going to take just an unfortunate timing with a VSC or a safety car that gave the McLarens a cheap pit stop, which we almost had. But even if that happened, I still think Max would have had the speed to get around the McLarens and take home this victory. So an incredible, incredible weekend by Max. Dominant performance. I mean, I honestly can't remember the last time a McLaren got beat by 19 seconds. We've seen them beat before, especially since they've turned things around at the end of 2023, going into 2024, but very rarely do we see them beat like this. So a very special weekend by Max and Red Bull, and a very special win for him in Monza. Before we go to the McLarens, because we have a lot to talk about with them, with this whole strategy call by the McLaren pit wall to swap the drivers, I want to touch on Yuki real quick. Ends up finishing P13 after he started P9. Not the result he needed. And a lot of those places lost were due to his early pit stop. So I think some strategy errors by the Red Bull pit wall to bring him in just way too early. You look at the cars who jumped him during the race. Lewis was just faster, and that was inevitable. He was always going to get around Yuki. But Yuki coming in on lap 20 for his pit stop, the rest of the cars that got around him, the two Williams, I think it was Ollie Behrman got around him too. There's one more that I'm forgetting, but They came in much later, and that gave them the tire advantage at the end of the race, which really hurt Yuki. So you want to see more from Yuki, though, especially with this Red Bull car that was so dominant this weekend. And Max being out in front, controlling the race from start to finish, and taking home the victory. You expected more out of Yuki, and it's going to be a result that probably hurts his chances of retaining this Red Bull seat. I think those chances might be gone. I think the decision, they're not announcing it yet, but I think in the back of their minds, Yuki's going to be out. They're going to bump up Isaac Hadjar up to the Red Bull team, bring in Arvid Lindblad, who, I don't know if you guys pay attention to F2, did not have a great weekend, so that might have helped Yuki's chances a little bit, but I can't see Red Bull moving on with Yuki going into 2026, but time will tell. I might be wrong on that, but we'll see how that all plays out. Going to McLaren. Lando finishes P2, Oscar finishes P3. Probably where they would have finished, even if we didn't get some controversy at the end of the race. It might have been Oscar P2, it might have been Lando in P3, but I think second and third was really their ceiling for this weekend. Again, this car just struggles a lot in straight line speed, and we have too much of that here to ignore, and that really hurt them this weekend and really took them out of contention for the race win. An uneventful race for them. Of course, Oscar had those battles with Charles Leclerc at the beginning, which was pretty exciting and gave us most of the excitement for this race, but once he got around Charles, it was really between Lando and Oscar, and Lando had a lot of pace this weekend and was really able to hold off Oscar in that first stint, at least at the beginning of the first stint, extending that lead. I think it got up to 6 seconds at one point. So you expected Oscar to kind of hang in there a little more than he did, but still credit to Lando. But at the same time, looking at the timing sheets, Lando's pace really started to fall off at the end of that stint. So I think might have burned through his tires a little bit, and Oscar was really closing the gap. But then we got the controversy with the pit wall, calling in Lando first for his first pit stop, and that's expected because Lando's the first McLaren car. It's just always how these things go. But Lando jumps on the radio and says, hey, let's bring Oscar in. I think it sounded like he was worried about Charles, but at the end of the day, Charles was way too far behind Oscar to really put that P3 at jeopardy. But still, Lando insisted, no, bring Oscar in first. I'll come in the next lap. Let's cover off Leclerc. A risky move by Lando, and one that in the moment and even after the fact, I don't know if I fully understand, because you're in this championship battle with Oscar. Don't you want to take every advantage that you can? Why do you care about Charles Leclerc and if Oscar loses that position? I mean, of course, it's the team game with McLaren. We see it time in and time out that they're more focused on the team. They're not focused on the individuals, and Lando has definitely bought into that, and we saw, of course, Oscar buy into that today too. But Lando stays out. Oscar comes in. Oscar has a very quick pit stop. I think this was on lap 46, if I remember right. 45 or 46. 1.9 seconds in the pit stop. Lando comes in the next lap. Very slow pit stop. There was an issue with the left rear jack, or not jack, but the individual changing the tires. 5.9 seconds was his pit stop. Lost a lot of time. And it was something that, again, was completely out of Lando's control, like we saw last week with the DNF with the mechanical failure. But because of that, it gave Oscar enough time with that one lap being on fresh, soft tires. The extra 4 seconds that Lando lost in the pit stop, Oscar comes out in P2. And then we have this tense moment where we're watching on the broadcast thinking, how in the world is McLaren going to handle this? Because it looked like, again, another situation, back-to-back weekends, where Lando's losing out on his teammate and losing points for something that's completely out of his control, not driver error. So McLaren ends up making the call. We're going to swap the drivers. Of course, Oscar was not happy about this, and you don't blame him. He fought back a little bit on the radio, but of course obliged like he does. And it was a good team move by Oscar to give Lando the position back. And I think they did it at the right time too. They did it right away. Gave Oscar the opportunity to, hey, let's swap positions, but you're still able to fight him. And he tried to do it down that, he did do it down that front straight going into the first chicane. So maybe there are better places to do that going, maybe on that final run going into the final corner so he could get the DRS going into that final, or that front straight. But regardless, Lando takes P2, stays ahead of Oscar, fights him off. You could tell Oscar was a little upset about this after the race. But was this the right call by the McLaren pit wall to do this? There's a lot of talk and controversy coming out of this after the race. From a fan perspective, no, it wasn't the right call. It screwed Oscar over. He should have had P2, and it was something, even though it was out of Lando's control, it was completely out of Oscar's control too. But I think from a team perspective, just internal with McLaren, it probably was the right call just for team harmony and just to keep things consistent and to keep things smooth sailing for the rest of the season. Because if McLaren says no, Lando, we're not giving that position back, Lando's going to come out of this race very upset at what happened and thinking he got screwed over for a second race in a row by something that was out of his control. And of course, mechanical failures happen, but I think there was a lot of responsibility that was taken from the pit side of things, from the management side of things for McLaren last weekend for Lando's DNF, where they feel like they let Lando down. And if that doesn't happen last weekend, I think there's a good chance they don't make this call. But I think because of that, coming off the DNF, where Lando was just so devastated for losing those 25 points to Oscar from that race, and realistically, I mean, it was 18 points for the position that he lost, not finishing in P2, but I think they just came out of that and thought, we can't do this to him again. We can't. We have to keep the team harmony. And one thing that I want to get into later in the season is, if Oscar wins this championship, what is Lando's outlook going to be with McLaren for the rest of his career? Is he going to look in the mirror and say, can I really ever win a championship here with Oscar as my teammate? Or am I going to need to go to a different team and roll the dice with just hoping I land with a better car that can beat Oscar? Because the way things are going, and it hurts for Lando because he's been with this team for so long and he's been through so many struggles with this team, and now they're finally at a point where they're competitive. They have a championship winning car, and that year finally comes for Lando, and now he has a teammate who's caught up to him on skill and ability. So I think if Oscar ends up winning this championship, it's going to put Lando in a very tough spot, and I think McLaren knows that too. And I think they're probably looking at this situation, and it was a decision that was made on the fly, but I still think in the back of their minds they're thinking, we have to keep Lando happy, and we have to make him think that we have his back, and we're going to keep things fair. And it was similar to Hungary a little bit of last year, and those two swapping the positions. It was a little bit different, though. But from a team perspective, I do think it was the right call for McLaren to swap those two. Of course, Oscar didn't like it, but credit to him for being the team player and going along with it and really not putting up too much of a fight, because we saw that last year with Lando really taking it to the end before he swapped positions to give Oscar that win last year for his first victory of his career. But not an easy decision. I don't know if there's really a right or wrong answer to this. I think it really depends if you're a fan, if you're within the McLaren, team personnel, based on how you feel about this. But just from a team perspective, keeping the harmony of this team, keeping things fair for the rest of the season, it probably was the right call for them to make. But from a fan perspective, I don't blame anyone who's looking at this thinking, Oscar shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have made that call. They should have let him stay in P2. And to another point too, I'm a little surprised that Oscar didn't put up more of a fight for that position and giving that position back. Again, it's the McLaren way. They're always thinking about the team, and they just harp on, this is about the team, this is not about the driver, and both drivers have bought in. But we saw a little bit with it with Max's radio call when he found out that they swapped positions, and he was like, are you kidding me? Just because Lando had a slow pit stop? If this was Max Verstappen in this situation, if this was Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher, a lot of championship drivers that we've seen in the sport, they're not giving that position back. They're fighting it, they're holding on to that position, and they're just going to deal with whatever comes afterwards. So a little telling on Oscar's, just perspective with this whole team game with McLaren, and it just shows you how much he's bought in. But very, very controversial call by the McLaren pit wall, but again, I think ultimately it probably was the right one. Going to Ferrari, a good weekend for them, probably not the weekend they wanted. Charles Leclerc finishes P4 after starting P4, Lewis Hamilton makes it up to P6 after starting P10 with that grid place penalty. For Charles, I think this was the best he could have done this week. And he put up a great fight with Oscar at the beginning of the race. But again, this Ferrari car, even with its strengths at this track, just did not have the speed today to catch up to the McLarens. And really, Max was completely out of the picture for them. So Charles, uneventful race for him other than the first few, laps with that fight with Oscar. But still, a P4 finish. Of course, he would have loved to be on the podium, loved to celebrate in front of the Tifosi and just the sea of red on the track underneath the podium, which is always a great sight to see, even when there's not a Ferrari driver on the podium. So a little disappointing for him that he couldn't come away with that result, but still, P4 is a good finish for them. And a lot better. They showed more pace than we've seen the last few races. So maybe they figured something out with this ride height. They still have a long way to go, though, especially if I don't really know if they're going to win a race this year. There are a couple more tracks that could play to their advantage. You look at tracks with the long straights like Vegas, Mexico City. It'll be tough, though, because what we saw from Max today in the Red Bull really put them ahead at tracks like this, where you would think Ferrari would have the advantage, and it looks like Red Bull's figure something out. So probably not the result Charles wanted, but still a good result for him. Lewis finishing in P6, really impressive start to the race. Made up 4 spots in the first 7 laps. That grid penalty hurt, and you wonder what would have happened if it wasn't for that grid penalty, because he would have started P5. What does the start of the race look like? How far can he get ahead? He did get around much slower cars to start that race and gain those positions. And once he caught up to George, who had much stronger pace, well, not stronger pace, but stronger pace than the other cars that Lewis had passed up to that point, Lewis struggled a little bit. And you wonder, did he burn through his tires a little bit too early at the beginning of that race, making all those maneuvers, making up all those positions? Did that hurt him in that final stint? But still for Lewis, a good recovery drive for him to make it up to P6. You probably would have hoped for a little better from him, but still, not a bad result for Lewis, especially coming after the disappointing result in Zandvoort last weekend. So I don't know if it's going to get better for Ferrari going into the season, but at least it was a little bit of a step in the right direction after last weekend. Going to Mercedes, George finishes P5 after starting in P5, and this was a theme for a lot of the drivers. They finished around where they started the race. This was probably the best George could have done today. Pitting him before Leclerc probably hurt him a little bit, but not enough to really make a difference. The only thing I think Mercedes could have done to get a better result today was start George on the hard tires and switch to medium tires and just do an alternate strategy. But that's risky, starting as high as they did in P5 and just not knowing how the race is going to play out. It would have worked, but it definitely would have been a roll of the dice for George. So good result for him. Uneventful race for him. We really didn't see a lot or hear a lot from him throughout the broadcast, but still P5. Good result for Mercedes. His teammate, Kimi Antonelli, finished P9 after starting P6. Just a sloppy race for him. In another sloppy race. We've seen this way too often with him. Really bad start to the race. And he lost 4 places right off the get-go. Ended up getting a 5-second penalty for erratic driving for that incident with Albon halfway through the race, which ultimately cost him 1 position. Not what you wanted to see from Kimi. I talked about it in the preview episode too, but I was really interested to see, was he going to have the pace to at least finish close to George? And he didn't. Of course, a lot of that came down to the bad start, but if he still had the pace in that car, he should have been able to make up those positions. But another sloppy race for him. And it's just becoming too much of a theme for him. And you would hope that coming out of the summer break, things would have been a little bit different. He would have been able to hit the reset button and kind of turn things around for the end of the season. But it's not looking good for Kimi at all as we head into the final 8 races now for the rest of the season. There's still time to turn it around. And again, Toto made comments about this after last weekend. The pressure's not really on Kimi this season. They understand he's a rookie. They understand it's going to be a learning year. They understand he's going to make mistakes, but the mistakes just keep on happening for him. And you want to see some improvement. And it's more concerning that Kimi started the season so strongly. Of course, the high point was the podium in Canada, finishing P3. And it's just been all downhill from there. So, a lot of people talking. Was this move made too early? Is Kimi really ready for Formula One? He's a rookie, so I'm not going to jump on that bandwagon yet, but it's just not looking good for him. And to at least get some momentum going into next season, I think he needs to start getting some much better results. All right, let's talk some midfield teams. It wasn't the stellar day for the midfield teams like we saw with Nico Hulkenberg getting a podium in Silverstone or Isaac Hadjar getting a podium last weekend, but it was still a pretty good day for a lot of these midfield teams. Let's start with Williams. Alex Albon finishing P7 after starting P14. This one really came down to strategy. Pitting Alex much later on lap 42, but also starting him on the alternate strategy, starting the race on hard tires, which gave him a huge tire advantage at the end of the race with mediums. It was a good day for Williams, though. They had a lot of pace, at least a good day for Alex Albon. We'll get to Carlos Sainz in a second, but this car had a lot of speed around this track, and it was a track with the straight line speed. That's the strength of this Williams car, and we expected to see a lot of pace from them on Sunday, and that's exactly what we got. But a huge, huge jump for Alex Albon in a race where we didn't really see a lot of movement. For him to make up 7 positions and finish all the way up in P7, really good result for him and really good points finish for the team too, especially when it looked like halfway through this season, Williams probably wasn't going to have the opportunities to get points finishes like we saw at the beginning of the season, but they've surprised us all and really turned things around. I don't know what they're doing with the setup of their car because there really aren't the upgrades that are coming, especially with teams turning their focus towards 2026. So they're doing something right over there, but it's really paying off, and we've seen that the last few races. For Alex's teammate, Carlos Sainz finishes P11 after starting P13, so he did make up a few positions, but another sloppy race from him. He had that incident with Ollie Behrman where they spun each other out. It looked like more of a racing incident to me, but if anything, I thought it was more Sainz's fault for just turning into Ollie, knowing he was there. Of course, there's the whole debate, and it's just such a gray area sometimes of whose corner it is and how the rules apply, but I thought, if anything, Sainz would get the penalty for that, but he didn't. But even without that, spun him out. I don't know if he got any floor damage or wing damage from that. I don't think he got any wing damage, but I did see some pieces fly out from underneath his car, so probably a little bit of floor damage there that might have slowed him down a little bit, but not the result that he wanted, especially when you see the pace that Alex Albon had. Now, of course, a lot of this came down to strategy, like I mentioned with Alex, and Carlos jumped on the radio right after the race and said, what is this about? Why did Alex get this favorable strategy and I didn't? What are we doing here? And he does have a point. Now, I think a lot of times with these midfield teams, they look at the strategies, and when it's on the fence, they say, all right, this driver's going to go with one strategy, this driver's going to go with the other. One of you guys is going to come out on top, and one's going to have a more favorable strategy, and there's always going to be a loser in that situation. And unfortunately for Carlos, he was the one who came out on the losing side today with strategy, but a little bit on his side too, with that incident with Ollie Behrman and just losing time there, spinning out, and losing probably some performance with the car too. But still, overall for Williams, much better day than probably they expected with Alex finishing up in P7. Going to Racing Bulls, Isaac Hadjar finishes P10 after starting from the pit lane. Again, not a race where we saw a lot of overtakes. So for Isaac to get all the way up there, make up, I think he started first because Pierre Gasly started in the pit lane too. I think Isaac started first in the pit lane. So to make up 9 positions, but also too to just start from the pit lane, always puts yourself at a disadvantage there. He did take a new power unit, so maybe he gained a little bit of performance with that new power unit that helped him out. But also too, just a really good strategy by the Racing Bulls pit wall to start him on hards and go on to the mediums at the end of the race. And with the hindsight, that looks like that was probably the better strategy today. Now, we did have the mixed strategy with teams starting on the mediums and going to the hards, so that added to it too, where, if everyone started on the hards, went to the mediums, we're not going to see that difference where we're looking at this, second strategy as being the more favorable one as much. But I still think it probably gave drivers a little more pace and just a better race result today. So ultimately for Isaac and the Racing Bulls team, Very strong weekend for them because this car showed a lot of pace despite the poor qualifying results from Saturday, and they made up a lot of ground during this race. Going to Isaac's teammate, Liam Lawson finishes P14 after starting P18, so he wasn't in the points, but still made up a handful of positions, which was really good for him and shows that this Racing Bulls car did have a lot of speed today. For Liam, though, another wheel-to-wheel banging incident with another driver, this time with Yuki. This happens way too much with him. I don't like to see it, and I'm honestly kind of tired of seeing it with him because it just... Formula One is supposed to be the top of the top, and you're supposed to understand the racing rules, have control of the car, and more often than not, we see Liam making these moves where he's making contact with some driver. Now, is it lack of skill? Is it just him being bold and aggressive? Probably a little bit of both. In, some situations where it's one or the other, but it just happens way too often. And it makes you think, is there a little bit of desperation for Liam? Wondering, am I going to stay on this Racing Bulls team? What is my outlook for my Formula One career going to be over the next few years? And just the uncertainty of that whole situation. Now, with Liam in the race, with a better strategy, it definitely would have been a better points finish. But starting on the softs, pitting him on lap 10 for the hards, and just doing the rest of the race on those hard tires really hurt him later in the race. Just having that tire offset to the other drivers who ended up getting around him. So definitely would have been a better result, with a better strategy for Liam Lawson. But still, a little bit of blame on him for having another wheel-to-wheel incident with another driver. Going to Sauber, Gabriel Bortoleto finishes P8 after starting P7. Their car looked really strong this weekend. Now, he was hurt a little bit by the early pit stop. Might have had the chance to at least gain one place if they went a little longer, but still a result the team will be happy with. And again, like we saw with a lot of drivers today, he finished around where he qualified, and there just wasn't a lot of movement. So, not much more he could have done outside of strategy, but still a really, really good result for this midfield team as they continue on and try to gain more ground in this midfield race. For his teammate Nico Hulkenberg, disappointing day for him. Didn't even start the race. Had a hydraulic issue that they noticed on the formation lap. Brought him in right away. Retired the car before the race even started. Tough break for Nico because he might have had a chance for a point or two if he was able to race. Starting, I think he was going to start P12, if I remember right. So as long as they didn't screw up the strategy, he definitely would have had a chance to get a points finish and would have been a double points finish for the Sauber team, which would have been really important. But still, without that, Gabriel finishing P8, pretty good result. Pretty good weekend for the team. Going to Haas, Esteban Ocon finishes P15 after starting P15. Got a 5-second penalty for forcing Lance Stroll off the track. They definitely could have done more with strategy, but they rolled the dice hoping for a late safety car to get Ocon into the points, and it just never happened. So I don't really blame Haas for making that call and just saying, hey, what can we do here? Because before that, they didn't really have the pace to make any ground, and it wasn't the type of race where there were a lot of overtakes. So it really was their best bet at making something out of this race. The odds just didn't play into their favor today. For his teammate, Ollie Behrman, finished P12 after starting P11. He ended up with that 10-second penalty for that incident with Sainz. Really surprised by the steward's decision to give him that penalty. In 10 seconds, I'd have to look back at how the rules are written and if that 10-second penalty was mandatory or if they could have gone with a 5-second penalty or something, less severe. But even just the principle of it, what can Ollie do in that situation? I guess back out of the corner and let Carlos go around. But again, it looked like Carlos turned into Ollie and just didn't give him the space to go through that chicane. And again, it is a tight track. It's hard to leave that space in those situations. But still, I don't think it was something that warranted a penalty. Now, fortunately for Ollie, looking at the timings, it probably didn't cost him anything. Because I think he finished, 15 seconds behind Carlos Sainz, and Carlos was going to get around him anyway and take that position. I don't think Ollie really had a chance of getting ahead of Carlos on pace. So overall, tough break for him to get that penalty, but I don't think it really cost him too much at the end of the day. Going to Aston Martin, tough day for them. Lance Stroll finishes P18 after starting P16. Lost a few positions, rolling the dice, going long, and hoping for that safety car too, and it just didn't work out for him. Again, same with Haas. I don't blame them for rolling the dice and going with that strategy call, because if it works, he's probably in the points, and it's a pretty good result. And we're talking singing praises about Aston Martin, saying, wow, they really nailed it today. But, fortune just wasn't on his side. But tough for him, because his teammate did have a lot of pace before he retired his car. So for Fernando, again, another race, and Lance has improved. I talked about that in the preview episode, or maybe it was the recap episode last weekend. But, Lance has had 3 of the last 4 races before this weekend finished in the points. So he's turned things around. But another race where Fernando's just completely outperformed him. And again, without that DNF. But going to Fernando's DNF, tough break for him, because he started P8. It looked like he was definitely headed for a points finish. Now, the DNF was for a suspension failure. You look at the footage of that incident. He goes over the curb, automatically, breaks his suspension. You see the sparks flying out right away. So definitely some fault on Fernando's part for, losing the car on that part of the track, going over the curb that caused that. But at the same time, is there some, structural issue with the rear suspension of the Aston Martin that led to this? Because we see cars go over the curbs plenty of times, and we don't really see the rear suspension failing like it did for Fernando's car today. So some more misfortune for him, but still some blame on his part too. But again, a tough result, because probably would have put him into the points. Now, they did, right before that, bring him into the pits. If Fernando finishes this race, depending on where he ends up, it might have been a bad strategy call for them too, because we saw that with a handful of other drivers where they came in way too early, and it hurt them later in the race with just the different strategy calls that were made by the other teams. But just pitting way too late, or pitting later in the race, was the much better call. So that might have been something that hurt Fernando later in the race if he finishes the race, but we'll never know. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because he was out of this race on lap 25 with that suspension failure. Finishing up with Alpine, we knew it was going to be a tough weekend for them in a tough Sunday, and it was, with Pierre Gasly finishing P16 after starting from the pit lane, Franco Colapinto finishing P17 after starting P17. They just didn't have the pace, and we knew they weren't going to have the pace. They were slow in the straights, they're slow in the high-speed corners, they're slow in the low-speed corners, they're slow really everywhere, and we expected them to finish towards the bottom of the order, and that's exactly what happened during this race on Sunday. For Pierre, rolled the dice with strategy 2, going long, hoping for a safety car. Again, I don't blame him. It didn't work, but I really don't blame them for trying to make that call and seeing if they can make, something out of nothing with this race today. For Franco, pretty run-of-the-mill race for him. His strategy fell in line with most of the field, but again, this Alpine car just was not fast around this track, and these results were probably what we expected out of them today. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode, recapping the Italian Grand Prix. We shouldn't be surprised at this point, but here we are on another Sunday, coming out of another race, just shaking our heads at the brilliance of Max Verstappen and his ability to pull out these race wins when the odds really aren't in his favor. We're off next weekend, but after that, we are off to Azerbaijan for the first race of the final third of the season. I will, of course, be back that weekend with a preview episode heading into the weekend, followed by a recap episode coming out of the Grand Prix on Sunday. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.